and it focused on ColdFusion 7. And Chris Ng actually gave a talk last year on kind of the application and code side of that, but it kind of reached my interest and got me kind of motivated to work on a talk for it. And people in the ColdFusion community are really developer focused, and they didn't really want a security guy like me who just really wanted to know how to fuck it up. They didn't really want to give me a lot of information on it, so I kind of had to go through and figure that stuff out. So ColdFusion, there are basically two things. You have the Adobe product, which is called ColdFusion. ColdFusion markup, is that working? Is mic still on? Okay. And there's ColdFusion markup language, which is basically the language, so the ASP, the HTML, the JavaScript piece of that, whatever. There's the language of ColdFusion, and then there's Adobe's product. There's also other open source products, Halo, Mira, CMS, and some other things that are actually will run ColdFusion markup language, but aren't Adobe ColdFusion. So we're primarily just going to talk about Adobe's ColdFusion. So according to Adobe, 12,000 companies use it, applications, 11,000 downloads, a bunch of user groups. So according to Adobe, it's pretty largely used, I would think. Lots of people use it, so Boeing, lots of education, NASA, Gov. Probably everyone, you probably can't read it, but there's lots of pretty big names on the list there. If you're into like Pac-10 and big schools, all these schools are actually ColdFusion shops. So it's got some presence. According to Mira, CMS, those guys use it as well. There's some overlap, so I don't know if they're just picking .index.cfm or what. But. So according to Google, there was 750 million sites running it. That seem like a lot? It's a few, okay. And so if you want to find sites running it, there's lots of Google Dorks for that, and that's an example of some. And some of those will give you things like index of component utils is definitely Adobe ColdFusion. So you can do searches for that. That came up with about 4,600 results, most of those. Usually you can sometimes find misconfigured servers when you're using these Google Dorks. And so this is an example of directory listings enabled, but it's also a ColdFusion system. You've got sites like .cfm, which has a list, kind of not really updated, but a lot of the ColdFusion 7 ones are still ColdFusion 7. So if you're actually wanting to go test code or look around at things and see who's actually running some of this stuff, the site's mostly accurate, and then has an export to CSV if you want to go that route. People will sometimes bookmark useful things. So like Delicious had a couple people who had bookmarked their admin interfaces out on the net, so you can go there and look at stuff. So this is kind of what it looks like. ColdFusion 5. Haven't seen one of these on the internet in quite a while. 6 I've seen. 7 I've seen quite a bit. So if you notice up to 7, there was only password authentication, so no username. Starting with ColdFusion 8, you actually had the option for having a username. There's 9. So 9 is what most people you'll find running. Well, that's what Adobe tells you to be running. And then they just released last month 10 beta. So the public beta is out for that if you want to mess with it. So going after it and finding stuff, I wrote, similar to last year, I did an Oracle talk on attacking Oracle on the web. I basically wrote a little scanner that would look for common vulnerable ColdFusion URLs. So I'll be releasing this after the talk. Basically just scans for current stuff and then as far back as like ColdFusion MX6 for vulnerable stuff. So if you come across one, you could run that and see if you've got any, useful URLs out. And this can help you find entry points and then vulnerable things. That's just another page of it. According to CV details, there was a whopping 43 vulnerabilities in all time for ColdFusion. Is that a lot, or is that not many? What do you guys think? No, I don't think it's that many, actually. And if you look at it, the majority of those are actually cross-site scripting bugs. So depending on where you live in the world, that may or may not be useful to you. But that's not that many code exec. I think it says 2 for code execution. I think I'm going to show that you can actually use a bunch of little things to equal code execution in ColdFusion. That's the idea of the talk. So Common vulns that you'll run into. Information disclosure is really, really prevalent. Cross-site scripting, SQL injection is common, and admin interfaces are exposed. And I'll have a whole section on that later. So information disclosure, ColdFusion comes in Enterprise and Standard. Enterprise allows you to also run JSP in conjunction with ColdFusion, where Standard will only run ColdFusion and HTML. If you want to find the two, it's pretty simple. You basically look for a non-existent JSP page. If you get a 404, it's Enterprise because it handles JSP. You won't just say, hey, that's not there. Where if it's Standard, you'll get a license exception or a 500 error. Useful, so it helps me fingerprint which is which becomes useful later on down the road. Very common to see debugging enabled, and when debugging is enabled, you'll actually get full path disclosure. Useful for anybody that does web apps or does anything. Is that useful? Yeah. Helps a lot to know, one, is it Windows or Linux, and then two, what's the full path? So if you've got file uploads or you've got directory traversals, you kind of need that piece of information to get useful things. So that's one for Windows. Here's one for Linux. So I probably wouldn't have guessed that if I was looking at that app. I very rarely see things in /export/home. So that's kind of an example of, hey, I wouldn't have guessed that, so it was really handy that that was available to me with a single tick mark. Another example of a Windows one. So this one was kind of in its normal place, C, inetpub, wwroot, where the first one was not, or maybe it was not. So that was the D. A lot of times you can also get, you can actually get the database query to come out if debugging is enabled. So in this case, I put a tick in for ID equals 1 tick, and then it actually showed me where the variable was blowing up. Useful? Yeah? Okay. Also, down in the kind of underneath the red box shows, it's commented out, but the data source, so it actually showed me the database name. You usually get the JDBC error, so you know if it's MS SQL, Access, Oracle, whatever. And it also had a full path disclosure on that too. And then just another example of this one. This one was actually doing some CF param, so you can actually write secure code with this, but again, just showing where the database, it showed basically the full database query and how it was being constructed. So if you're going to go after SQL injection, there's some other things you can, basically it has the full database query there for you to look at. So lots and lots of information disclosure. So cross-site scripting, who there likes cross-site scripting, thinks it's neat? I don't. I'm a network guy, brought up network guy primarily. So I don't get as excited about cross-site scripting as some people do, but it can be pretty cool for ColdFusion. Chris Ng actually last year talked a lot about script protect. It's basically a blacklisting approach. There's the blacklist. So any of you guys that raised your hand see some problems with the blacklist for that? Can you bypass that? Yeah, a couple yes. So the answer is yes. If you go read Chris's white paper, he goes into really good detail on how to bypass it. So old ColdFusion, you can just throw scripts in. Newer ones, you can do things like body unload and some other things. Again, Chris's paper goes into really good detail of why script protect is not so good and ways to get around it. We'll talk more about that later. SQL injection. Almost every time I see equals some number in ColdFusion, it's vulnerable to SQL injection. Will can attest to that in the back, yeah? So if you're ever doing a ColdFusion app and you see equals some number, there's a good chance that query is vulnerable. And so a recent pen test, this is some of the code that was actually returned back to me in an error page. And then, so doing that code came from that query, and I basically just did your add version, and then we had error-based injection in that. So useful. I got the SQL query back in the error page, and then we were able to look and say, hey, well, they're not doing any kind of sanitization on that, and then able to exploit that with, that's an example of error, and it also did union-based injection. So lots and lots of, in my experience, SQL injection for ColdFusion apps. So got an InstaShell section. So basically, even though CVE details said there was basically 2 remote exploits, I've got at least 3 that I know of, and that's these 3. You have the Blaze DS AMF external XML entity injection bug. ColdFusion 8.01 had an FCK editor. They enabled the connector and also had a vulnerable version of FCK editor. And then has everyone heard of like the locale path traversal that came out about 2 years ago? That was actually a pretty big bug. That started out as like an information disclosure bug, and then a bunch of the guys complained. The guy from GNU Citizen was like, hey, no, that's actually code execution, and went into this whole big long thing of turning path traversal into code execution, which you don't always get to do. Right. Right. The big point that they made for that was that Adobe and I guess CVSS had rated it as like a 5 or something, and in reality it should have been a 10. So you probably can't read that, but this is kind of an example of when you go click on a patch, you have this giant list of instructions. So it's like download the zip file, go to the admin page, take a backup of your stuff, unzip the thing, overwrite this file, and I'll go here and do this. Well, if you've got this, you need to do that. So I'm not a ColdFusion admin, but I could probably make a mistake in that long process of things for patching. The admin interface doesn't actually alert you that a patch is available. You kind of got to look at Adobe and follow the mailing list and do some other things. So now, with most CMSs and other things, we're kind of getting used to the application telling me that I have a patch to apply, right? Yeah. That's kind of the norm these days, where ColdFusion does not. So when you start doing this and you start seeing vulnerable things and you start to wonder why I start seeing vulnerable instances of ColdFusion, to me this is one of the reasons that I would think this would happen. Is very manual process. And same thing for upgrading. When you talk about upgrading from 7 to 8, 8 to 9, most of those settings don't carry over. So if you've done lockdowns and other things, you actually have to go through and redo that again. So, pro tip. For all the InstaStell stuff, it's kind of version dependent. Not my module, but inside of Metasploit is a ColdFusion version module, which if the admin interface is up, which is the ones I showed you on the hit list, it can actually query that, find out if it's 6, 7, 8, 9, and then return that back to you. You can also just check a WSDL file that exists in it. I know for sure on 7 through 9. I haven't had that chance to check on 6. But at that URL, so you've got site, CFID, admin API, base, CFC, WSDL, will actually tell you the exact ColdFusion version you're running, which is useful. I'll make all these slides available later for you guys. But so that's handy because it tells you basically major version and then some of the minor versions. If not all the patches actually increase the minor version, but some do. So that's 2 examples of seeing that, hey, that one was running 9 in this version and 8 in this version, which can help you identify if some patches are applied or not. Useful? So the XML into the injection, there's the link to the advisory. Basically, it gives you arbitrary file read on vulnerable hosts. There's a Metasploit module for that. That's the versions that it's vulnerable in. So 9, 8, 8.0, and 7.02. So it kind of looks like that. You can basically do an entity injection at the top, so that just tells me that I want to see the contents of C ColdFusion 8 lib password.properties, and then in the XML response that comes back will actually be the file if it exists. So pretty useful, yeah? Cool. Also, we'll do directory listings, so if you need to actually kind of navigate around and you didn't have information like path disclosure, you can kind of just say, okay, oh, well, I can see what's in C, I can see what's in C download, so this is one of my more favorite ones because they actually had ColdFusion patches as a folder, but they hadn't actually applied any of the patches for this bug. And they had Tripwire too, which I thought was humorous, but none of that worked. All right, that joke died. FCK editor. Anybody see when this bug came out? Yeah, Dan. Yeah. So at the top, instead of asking for a file, I just asked for C downloads, and then it returned the contents of like a directory listing for C downloads. Yeah. The paper goes into pretty good detail of why it's doing that. It's like a 10-page white paper from the security assessment guys on why it's doing that and exactly why that works. Yeah. I could try to explain it, but the white paper does